Hello and welcome to June CRC Café. I know we are already in July, but I greatly apologize for the delay of this. I did have some health problems that had me in the hospital, but things are looking up, things are looking better, so we're back on track. So I am very excited for this talk because this celebrates and concludes the work of Alex Carver. She is a master's student at Clemson University that just passed her final examinations, and I know will go on to big and great things. I'm sure you've heard her talk before earlier in earlier CRC cafes, talking about propagation and some of the earlier work she was doing. But now her work is finished. All of the data is gathered, and I'm going to walk through some of the things that she hasn't hit on yet. Where there were pending results. So this will be really neat to follow up and see what she found. But first off is a couple member updates. Remember, September 27th is when we're having our meetup. We're welcoming everyone out to our facility where we'll go over research. We'll meet and greet and talk. You'll see our new production area and what we're doing, get some hands-on, eyes-on experience with us and our team. So this will be a beautiful time to get together on a smaller, very personal level with some of these vendors that will bring tools and all sorts of new gadgets that will help you in your facility. Also, I want to just emphasize that I have been spending some time back in the microscopy lab, and just a reminder, be kind to your trichomes. This is just a quick little project I did when I was at the lab. Simply took a bud, no damage, put it under the scope, and this is what you get and what you would expect. On the left, you see trichome glands that are not altered at all. I took that bud, I smushed it in my fingertips as hard as I could, and this is what you see on the side. So it was a little bit surprising to myself as well. I figured there'd be damage and, problems, but this was pretty eye-opening in that every single glandular head was busted and was either left on my finger or within the plant material. So no trichomes in sight. So just a interesting picture difference that I thought you may enjoy seeing. So to the main event, Alex's work. So her project was really looking at the factors that influence propagation. Now, when her work started a few years ago, this was when propagation, whether marijuana or hemp, was starting to happen in large greenhouses. So, a very different setup where it's not just a couple hundred plants at a time, or it's very easy to put domes over, individual trays. It was getting to the point where, cannabis is being grown like a horticultural crop under mist and, fast efficiency. Well, the growers were having trouble, and there are many that are still having trouble to this day with, 65 to 75% success. And so that's a lot of wasted time, a lot of effort, a lot of wasted material, just from the amount you have to stick to make up for your actual desired count. So yeah, her project really focused on some of the important things that you can consider in propagation. Looking down at this list, she did go over bullets 1 and 2, auxin applications, moisture content of propagation and substrate, and she touched on the stock plant nutrition in previous CRC meetings. But today I'll finish out stock plant nutrition, and we'll look at propagation fertilization and what that really looks like. You may be surprised. So experimental design, we've got 2 cultivars, THM Jack and Peach Haze, and these were chosen because they are very different in that Peach Haze is usually more finicky in rooting, so lower rooting percentages, whereas Jack usually has quite good numbers. It's 3x3 factorial, 9 treatment combinations. Ultimately, she had a lot of cuttings and a lot of reps, and so absolute props. Nothing she will ever forget is having to count and weigh roots. So high numbers means you can trust the results, you can trust the statistics. So let's jump in. So here's the setup. We've got 3 stock plant treatments. So 100, 200, and 300 parts per million nitrogen. 200 is about standard in terms of what would be applied to mother stock. So in actuality, we've got a low, medium, and high. This was of the same fertilizer, 15-5-15, and so it wasn't just nitrogen changed. It was basically EC manipulated until you get those standard nitrogen rates. So everything in that fertilizer treatment did go up as well. So your magnesium, potassium, et cetera, et cetera. And then from there, from each stock plant, we would have 3 treatments that would be done to the cuttings in propagation. So no fertilizer in propagation, 100 parts per million nitrogen in propagation, and 200. And this was done from every stock treatment. Okay, so here's the methodology. Peters 15-5-15, pretty standard horticultural, general, complete fertilizer. Stock plants were watered with 200 parts per million nitrogen up until it was time to implement treatments. Cuttings were fertilized prior to sticking, and then every week after until harvest. Something to keep in mind is that the cutting trays were watered with sub-irrigation. That way you weren't getting any sort of foliar treatment effects from drenching from above. And then cuttings were evaluated 2 weeks after sticking, which is quite standard. Just to give a little more detailed idea of the timeline, weeks 1 through 4, plants were fertilized with this 200 parts per million treatment. At week 5, so after 4 weeks of that, at week 5, then we began to split into the different mother stock treatments. This was done by having a flush of those treatments at that first week, so running 14 liters through the media to immediately change that EC of the root ball and the nutrients that are there, and then 1 to 2 liters per day, just depending on how they were drinking. Plants were cut and in propagation for 14 days. Okay, so let's get to the good stuff. So these are results for Jack. Here on the left side, we've got root fresh weight. The graph on the right is rooting percentage. Here on the bottom for both graphs is propagation fertigation treatment. So this would be in parts per million. Here in the different types of lines, we've got stock fertigation treatment, 1, 2, and 300 parts per million. And so looking at the graph on the left, what is immediate to see is that no matter what the treatment to the stock plants, there is benefit in providing fertilizer and propagation. So you can see here from 0 to 100, we've got quite the increase, and then it starts to taper down, except for the low fertility treatment to the stock plant, which continues to benefit as it goes up and in nitrogen content in propagation. So, takeaway here for me really is as long as you are providing some nutrients somewhere between 1 and 200 parts per million nitrogen, you are going to see benefit. You're going to have greater root weight. And this is a great thing for. So that's root weight. But what about rooting percentage? All right. So
again, what sticks out to me is here, this bold line. That's the high fertility treatment with the 200, the medium treatment being. All right, so let's look at rooting percentage. So my greatest takeaway here is there is a very fine line between having too much fertilizer on your stock plants and just enough. So here, this lower line, this bold line is the high fertility treatment, where across propagation fertility treatments, you are getting significantly lower rooting at high fertility mother stock versus a medium fertility. So here the solid line is 200 parts per million. And again, no real difference between what you're fertilizing in propagation, but what you're fertilizing in your stock plants is quite impactful for Jack. The other thing to take note of is the low fertility treatment. You are actually getting some impact from the fertilizer that you put in propagation, because obviously your mother plants are already starting at a much lower elemental content. So you are seeing some benefit here, but again, a greater decrease when you go a little bit higher. And so takeaway for me here is that um, apply fertilizer to propagation, because you're not going to see negative effects from adding it to stock plants that are getting sufficient nutrition. But if for some reason you might be underfeeding your stock plants, you will see a great benefit, going from 90 to almost 98% successful rooting. So here we're looking at shoot fresh weight. And again, the biggest takeaway here is that some fertility in propagation is going to do you justice. So significantly higher weights, no matter what you're feeding your mother stock, by adding some fertility to propagation. And so again, you're kind of seeing a peak here around 125, and so certainly a safe spot to implement into your garden. And here's Peach Haze. So same setup. You're only seeing one line representing the stock plants because there was no statistical difference between treatments. So very different, something to keep in mind. Peach Haze is one of those that's a little more finicky and rooting. So differences certainly doesn't surprise me. But it's clear, whether you're looking at rooting weight or rooting percentage, there is benefit by having nutrition provided in propagation, significantly higher difference. And most importantly, looking here at rooting percentage, regardless of the fertility program you have for your mother stock, if you don't have um, fertility in propagation, look at this, 30% rooting. That's a problem. But when you just add 100 parts per million nitrogen in your propagation regime, you're up here above 80%. So, thinking back to Jack and how those numbers were affected, it's pretty clear that there's no negative effect by putting, at least 100 parts per million nitrogen in your propagation program. You're going to end up with better rooting. You're going to end up with a greater mass of those roots as well as greater mass of the shoots. Be ready to go for flower, transplant. Start with a healthy and optimally nutrient loaded plant. Same results. Peach Haze, looking at shoot fresh weight. There is benefit from 0 to 100. Again, you're seeing that slope downwards once you pass 100. So safe call being right here for your fertility program and propagation.
Next, we'll talk about tissue nutrient analysis. So this was only done for Jack, and it was a collection of plants, which we would consider baseline, being right when they were took from stock, and then after they have been evaluated for rooting. And so this would only include the top of the plants. All right, so there's a lot of data here, and I'm going to cover portions of it just where we can walk through some of the certain sections. So here I'm only showing day 0, right off of the stock plants. What are the elemental contents by percent dry weight? in those cuttings, just the tops. The takeaway here for me is 200 and 300 parts per million. The cuttings nutrient content, you see how they all have A's. This means they are statistically not considered different than each other. But here, when we're looking at the 100 parts per million, all B's except for calcium, which is statistically the same throughout treatments, less fertilizer input, lower content of elements. But you would imagine, 300 being much greater than 200. You would expect to see a little difference, but actually there is no difference at day zero. So my takeaway here is why fertigate with a third more fertilizer to get 300 parts per million when you can have just as good rooting and just as good elemental content within the plant at 200 parts per million. All right, this is looking at just the day 14 data. I told you I'll show you it all together here in a minute, but it's a lot of data to wrap your head around. So this is looking just at day 14 here within fertigation treatments. So though this is a lot of data, it's pretty easy to skim over these columns and see, there's not much difference between, propagation or stock plant fertilization treatments. All very, very close and statistically just about the same. So, looking at this, I would suggest, no matter the treatment, they're all quite similar as far as elemental content goes. But you have to use the data we looked at previously to say, well, okay, even though from a elemental makeup of the plant, these look very, very similar, there was increase of rooting captured by this fertility difference. So again, takeaway, it's useful to have fertilizer in propagation. Here's everything together. Now that we've kind of separated it and looked it out in pieces, I think the biggest takeaway here, just about in every nutrient, is that there is a huge decrease from baseline to any of the fertility treatments and propagation. So ultimately, there is a lot of elemental content lost in those 14 days of propagation. And so knowing that fertility in propagation and as you're beginning to veg out in larger plants is super important to have on point, where you're growing these numbers back to where they should be, back where they were on the stock plant itself, to really help make the plant healthy and push through the different cycles that you're wanting it to do with the highest nutrient content, which is optimal for the plant. We did look at zinc, manganese, and sulfur, and again, very, very similar results in that there is a massive loss in 14 days, and that this should be considered in your fertility program. So conclusion here is fertilize your plants. Stock plants, you have to start with adequate fertilizer regime happening, and because there is carryover, there's heavy carryover. If you have too little fertilizer, you're going to get decreased rooting. If you have too high of fertilizer, you're going to have decreased rooting. So making sure that what you're starting, that cutting out, the beginning of that 14 days, is as optimized as you can get for that stock plant, is going to suit you better in the long run. Because as you just saw, the nutrient content is cut just about in half, just from being excised from the plant, stuck, and propagated. So not only does your fertility program need to be on point for your mother stock, but also for propagation, and knowing that you are already starting at half capacity of your mother stock, right at transplant after you've propagated your plants is super important, because you need to actively get those numbers back up to where they need to be, where you're ready to flower. Um, it is a must to have fertilizer in propagation. Anywhere from 1 to 200 parts per million nitrogen is going to set you up for success, greater rooting weight, greater rooting percentage. This could be a huge difference in the success of what you're propagating. But the other thing is, as you saw, a little bit different in Jack versus Peach Haze, is that you have to do in-house testing. This is just leading you to thoughts behind what different cultivars can express. So do in-house testing. Take your propagation plants, hit them at 100 parts per million, hit them at 150, hit them at 200, and see what your varieties do, especially those varieties that are a little more finicky. They might need something different. But again, genuine takeaway, make sure your fertilization program is on point, not too much, not too little, in-house testing. So thank you, and we will see you this month.